Hello, my name's Steve Elsom. I'm a 59-year-old semi-retired mental health nurse who now vapes and used to smoke. And this is my story about vaping. So I started smoking about the age of 18, which I suppose is a little bit older than most long-term smokers. In fact, as a child, as a teenager, I was quite anti-smoking and spent a lot of time, in fact, successfully convinced my father, who'd smoked for 40 years, to quit while I was a teenager. And then unfortunately took it up myself when I was 18. I suppose I could think of all sorts of excuses, but I was a professional musician. I started a mental health nursing career shortly after that. And in those days in mental health, smoking was the rule rather than the exception amongst both patient and staff. And typically a therapeutic encounter in the inpatient unit involved sitting down with a packet of cigarettes and offering a cigarette to a patient and then starting a chat like that. And often I'd go through a packet of cigarettes before lunchtime on a day shift, just through giving them away to start conversations. It was kind of an accepted way of working in those days. And thankfully we're a bit more enlightened these days. And of course, like many smokers, I made numerous attempts to quit. In fact, did quit quite successfully on quite a lot of occasions. My problem was always staying quit. For whatever reason, even though I did manage to quit successfully, as I said, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, even for a couple of years at one stage, something always made me relapse back into smoking, typically being at a party or something and having a little bit too much alcohol, having a puff on a cigarette. Before I'd know it, the following week I'd be back on my virtually a pack a day habit. But almost 3 years ago now, I was actually on a work trip in the UK and saw people using these funny electronic cigarette things with a light that came on the end, and made a few inquiries and found that I could just walk into a chemist shop in the UK and buy a starter kit over the counter. And that's exactly what I and my wife, who was also a smoker, we did while we were on that trip. And that day, the 25th of March 2015, so almost 3 years ago now, was in fact the last day either of us had a cigarette. So it wasn't really a deliberate attempt to quit, but just over the course of that day, my wife found these little devices that we bought. They produced a little bit of a smoke-like vapour, and the fact that they satisfied our craving. We found we just weren't feeling like a cigarette, and as I say, that was the last day. We just never touched another cigarette. So when we got back to Australia, of course, we initially did some ordering online and ordered our supplies from the UK, where we bought our original kits. Being a researcher for the last 10 years, I did look into the evidence, I looked into the laws and the legislative situation around Australia, and was not particularly surprised to find that it wasn't something that was supported by the government or by medical establishment in this country. But nevertheless, I did discover that there were quite a lot of vapors in Australia, and so I didn't have too much trouble acquiring replacement coils for my devices, and soon after started buying a few more devices, of course, because one of the things about vaping is that unlike cigarettes that are available in every corner store and every 7-Eleven and every newsagent, supermarket. But unfortunately, vaping takes a little bit more planning, given that we have to order our nicotine supplies from overseas. We can get devices in Australia, but there's not that many vape shops around, so we order them online. So there's always that bit of delay. So one thing most vapers learn very soon is the importance of having a backup device, because things do go wrong. You can easily drop your device and break it, or run out of juice, or burn a coil out or something. So a backup is critical, so that you don't feel that temptation to go back and buy a packet of cigarettes to relieve that nicotine craving. And it's just worked beautifully for myself and my wife. I've progressed on. I've made a little bit of a hobby of vaping. I like to make my own coils. I've even built some of my own devices. I mix my own juice. And all of that makes it very inexpensive. I mean, vaping is very inexpensive anyway, even if you just buy everything over the counter. And as a mental health professional, one of the things that immediately struck me was the possibilities of vaping for helping people with mental illness to quit cigarettes. And as we all know, it's people with mental illness do struggle to quit smoking. They smoke at much higher rates than other people. And this just seemed to me like an obvious solution, something that made quitting so easy. And I'd like to see the government embrace this as a public health initiative. I mean, purely consumer-driven public health revolution that I would hope that our government would get behind and support. But particularly, I think mental health professionals and health professionals generally really need to get on board the way it's happened in overseas countries like the UK, many countries in Europe, US, New Zealand more recently. We just have to get on board with this thing. It's a no-brainer. Lives are being lost to smoking that could be saved by people switching to vaping. So, yes, that's my story.